All right. Good morning, folks. It looks like we have quite a few folks online, so I'm going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to today's edition of the Conversations on Carbon webinar series. Today's webinar is on regional perspectives on mCDR along the U.S. West Coast, Alaska, and British Columbia. My name is Melanie Herrera, and I'm a Senior Science Policy Fellow with the California Ocean Science Trust, and I'll be your MC/moderator for today. The Conversations on Ocean Carbon webinar series aims to deliver the best available information on marine carbon dioxide removal, or mCDR, and to explore concepts related to coastal ocean carbon. This series cannot be done without our great partners. Ocean Science Trust works with Washington Sea Grant, the NOAA Ocean Acidification Program, California Current Acidification Network, the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network, Stanford, the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, and the Pacific Northwest and California Current mCDR nodes. So we work with these partners to make this series happen. So thank you to our partners. And here are the faces behind these fantastic partners that work to create dialogue among scientists, industry members, tribes, and natural resource managers throughout the Pacific Coast. Thank you again to this team, and thanks for everyone who's joining us today or who has joined us in the past. For today's webinar, we're going to have 5 speakers: Darcy Dugan from the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network, Meg Chadsey with Washington Sea Grant, Devin Todd from Ocean Networks Canada, Francis Chan with Oregon State University, and Kevin Travis from the Ocean Science Trust. Moving on to today's agenda, we have about 90 minutes for today's session. Each speaker will have about 15 minutes to spotlight mCDR efforts in their respective regions: Alaska, Washington and British Columbia, Oregon, and California. Then we're going to have a moderated Q&A at the end. A couple reminders before we jump in. Attendees, you all are in listen-only mode. There's a Q&A chat function at the bottom of your screen, so feel free to enter your questions in that function. If you have speaker-specific questions, feel free to state the speaker's name in the chat, and our speakers will try to answer those questions throughout the webinar. We'll save sort of more general or wide-reaching questions for the end. Please note that there's also a separate chat box where you can also chat with all the speakers or hosts directly. We'll also be doing a few poll questions throughout the webinar so we can get a better understanding of the audience and to gather some information for future webinars. Lastly, we are recording this session, and we will share it on YouTube over the next few weeks. With that, I'm going to kick us off officially with a quick background on mCDR. I'm sure most of you all are very familiar with what exactly carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, is, but for those who may not, here's some context setting. Why are we talking about CDR? In 2015, the Paris Agreement was adopted, and it laid out the well-known goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius to achieve climate neutrality or net zero emissions. To meet these goals, the IPCC, or Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, states that we need immediate, deep, and rapid cuts in greenhouse gas emissions, as well as carbon removal technologies and protection of natural carbon sinks like the ocean. You can see in this graph, the green area shows that we need CDR to address remaining emissions, or those that are hard to abate, and to reach net negative emissions. Furthermore, there's a general scientific consensus that limiting warming to 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius likely requires 7 to 9 gigatons of carbon dioxide removal per year by 2050. Today, however, we only remove about 2.1 gigatons per year, and this removal is almost entirely from conventional and land-based methods such as forests and soils. So we need this green area on the graph. Since we need to reach this green area on the graph, the ocean and the global carbon cycle is being explored as a potential pathway for CDR. These pathways are known largely as marine carbon dioxide removal, or mCDR. So why the ocean? As I mentioned earlier, the ocean is a natural carbon sink, so it has the potential to accelerate carbon removal and storage due to its vast size and unique biological and chemical processes. In fact, the deep ocean stores about 50 times more carbon than in the atmosphere or terrestrial biosphere. mCDR encompasses many pathways, mainly characterized as biotic or biological and abiotic or physical or chemical approaches. Some biotic approaches include micro and macro algae or small or big algae cultivation. This includes kelp farming, artificial upwelling to stimulate phytoplankton blooms or blue carbon. Abiotic approaches include methods like direct ocean capture and ocean alkalinity enhancement. Each of these pathways have promising science showing their potential role for CDR, but many scientific gaps in assessments and uncertainties remain. Assessments are being done and more are needed to understand multi-benefits as well as environmental, ecological, and social impacts. Before we move on to our first speaker, I'd like to conduct a few poll questions to get a sense of the audience. So my colleague Kevin will launch the first poll, which asks, what best describes your relationship with mCDR? So I'll give you all a few moments to answer. Looks like things are slowing down, so I think we can close the poll there. It looks like most folks are part of an active mCDR project, not currently involved, but interested in tracking the issue, and some folks on the regulatory management policy side. So thank you, folks. We'll move on to our next poll, which asks where you live or work. So feel free to check multiple if it's applicable. I'll give you a few seconds to answer this poll as well. I'm coming from San Francisco, so representing California. It looks like we have quite a diverse amount of folks coming from various places and working in various places, so great to see. And then I think we can move on to our last poll for now and close the poll number 2. This last poll asks, do you identify with any of the communities listed? So feel free to select all that apply. Awesome. It looks like we're getting also a diverse range of responses here. Folks coming from academia, private, nonprofit, government, tribal, indigenous community members, and ocean users. So appreciate everyone responding there. And so I think we're good to close that poll and get us started with our presentation. So we'll have a couple more polls later on, but for now, let's close that and let's move on to our first speaker, Darcy Dugan. Darcy, please join us and turn on your camera. Darcy is with the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network and will be leading the Alaska Spotlight. So Darcy, take it away.
Great. Thank you so much, Melanie. As Melanie mentioned, I'm with the Alaska Ocean Acidification Network, and I'm based with the Alaska Ocean Observing System in Anchorage on the traditional homelands of the Dena'ina people. So let's take a look at the Alaska landscape with respect to mCDR. I'll start off by saying that public understanding of mCDR in Alaska is pretty low, and this is true both on the policymaker and resource management side and also at the community level. And most of the conversations we've had, even at science events, have started out with explaining the concepts of mCDR for the first time. Another key part of the Alaska context is that concern about protecting fisheries up here is high. Alaska has a lot of healthy wild fisheries, fish stocks, but factors like warming and fish prices and geopolitics have put some pretty significant stress on fishermen. And there's a strong sentiment, particularly in coastal communities, of wanting to avoid new potential threats or wild cards. So that's kind of part of the backdrop here. There are currently no proposed or active projects in Alaska waters, but Alaska has been identified as a favorable place for iron ocean fertilization and ocean alkalinity enhancement, as well as microalgae cultivation. So it's likely that there will be some projects in Alaska in the near future. Um, and also at this point, there have not yet been a lot of efforts to educate or shape people's views on mCDR. Based on early engagement in two communities up here in the last month, it looks like comfort with mCDR is going to depend on how it's framed, how risks and benefits are communicated, and also whether local voices have control over decision making. And I'll be talking more about that in a minute within the engagement part. So next slide. Let's look at the policy landscape for a minute. Alaska differs from other states because there is currently no climate policy. Our current governor, Mike Dunleavy, took office at the end of 2018. And one of the first actions that he made was to eliminate the Climate Action Leadership Team and remove climate-related web resources from the State of Alaska website. He has shown interest in income from monetizing carbon storage. And in 2023, he proposed a set of laws that created a statewide carbon offset program, and also the regulatory framework for carbon capture, utilization, and storage. And that was passed by the legislature. So businesses in Alaska are allowed to sequester carbon underground and participate in carbon markets, but there is not a carbon pricing system, a compliance carbon pricing system. The state's focus so far has been on generating and selling carbon credits, not on setting mandatory emissions limits or requiring businesses to trade allowances. And there have been some carbon storage credits for forestry offsets sold by Alaska Native corporations to California entities in order to comply with California state laws, but there have been no credits for mCDR. I should also note that when Governor Dunleavy ruled the legislation out, he wrote an op-ed about it at the time, which was kind of starting to raise awareness of carbon removal concepts generally. And I also want to note that his second term ends at the end of this year. So a new governor will be elected up here in November, and there might be some change in the approach to climate and carbon. Next slide, please. I want to talk for a minute about kelp. Over the past few years, there's been a pretty big emphasis on expanding mariculture in Alaska, particularly with kelp. And this was set in motion by the governor prior, Governor Bill Walker in 2015, has also been endorsed by Governor Dunleavy. And there has been some significant funding that's come in, 50 million from the U.S. Economic Development Administration, 32 million from the Exxon Valdez Oil Spill Trustee Council for aquaculture research in the spill area. And the Alaska legislature has also provided 5 million in matching grants. And we've seen through the media that there's a misconception around kelp cultivation and its capacity for carbon removal. There's been a lot of news stories and interviews and quotes from politicians where people note that kelp efforts will be reducing atmospheric CO2, including the governor's op-ed that I spoke about earlier. And as we know, in order for that to happen, that requires the kelp to be sunk and to remain at the ocean floor for a long period of time. And that is not the aim of the current kelp initiatives in Alaska. There's market research going on to better set up structures to get that kelp to market for food or fertilizer or feed. So some broad scale clarification is needed under these different scenarios that kelp cannot also serve as an mCDR strategy. I also want to note that when discussing mCDR with Alaska community members and fishermen, the macroalgae cultivation approach has initially sounded to them more attractive than the other approaches until they understand the need for sinking the kelp and also the scale that would be required. And I think that scale is hard for all of us to conceptualize. The stats show that removing 1 gigaton of carbon through kelp cultivation would require about 1 million square kilometers of kelp farming, basically the size of the state of Texas. And so that magnitude and then the effect on the ecosystem and potential conflict with other uses has made those same fishermen and community members less open or comfortable with the idea of pursuing large-scale kelp for the purposes of mCDR. Next slide, please. So what's going on in Alaska as far as mCDR projects? As I mentioned earlier, there are no current or proposed field studies or commercial projects in Alaska waters. The closest one is XOS, the Exploring Ocean Iron Solutions Project, which is working on plans for a medium-scale field experiment in the North Pacific, which is about 600 miles offshore from Alaska. It's likely that others will be proposed in the future. The Gulf of Alaska and the Bering Sea are both cold and productive and already very efficient at absorbing carbon dioxide. And they've been identified as good places to test a couple of different methods, ocean alkalinity enhancement. The Gulf of Alaska has been identified as one of the highest priority locations in the Northern Hemisphere for ocean iron fertilization. Um, so it is likely that there will be projects proposed in the future. I wanted to call out a couple of activities on the engagement side. One is the CLAM project. The acronym there is Community Leaders and mCDR, which is designed to try to expand capacity for informed local input. And I'll talk about that one more in just a minute. Another is an mCDR journal club, which started out with mostly academics, but now also includes tribal and fishing community members. And that's been helpful in growing a cohort of people tracking and discussing these topics, which we didn't really have up here until about a year and a half ago. There's also been two op-eds in Alaska Beacon, the picture of one here. The initial piece was published by members of the Journal Club and the CLAM project, trying to raise awareness about mCDR and also that it's important for the public to track this issue and weigh in. And then there was a follow-up from the XOS team explaining their project and the importance of trying to learn from field studies, and also underscoring the need for integrity and collaboration in figuring out the science and governance around mCDR. And other than that, there has not been a lot of public discourse on mCDR in Alaska, at least that we're aware of. Next slide, please. And this is my last slide. It's got a little bit more on the CLAM project. So this is an initiative that was funded by Carbon 180 this past fall, with the intent to try to raise public awareness and begin to understand how coastal Alaskans want to approach mCDR. And a key part of this project is the local engagement is organized and facilitated by trusted local partners, including members of the fishing industry. And last month there were two workshops, one in Cordova and one in Kodiak. And the CLAM team has also briefed the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council. And there's a planned session at the Alaska Forum for the Environment coming up in a couple of weeks. And the team is also visioning how to try to help educate and engage with the Alaska legislature as well. And I can share some high-level observations and some of the takeaways from these first two community conversations. There was really productive conversation at both of these, and the aim was try to create a neutral space for learning and thinking together, and I think that was achieved. What we heard was a mix of concern and skepticism and curiosity. And a few clear themes emerged across both meetings. One is that people would like to have discussions about governance and decision-making authority up front. Also, that building trust was going to be really important. And I should note both of these communities were affected by the Exxon Valdez oil spill in 1989. They want risks and limits and exit strategies to be clearly articulated for any proposed project. And they also would like to see investment in local institutions and leadership. If there's going to be a project, they want to be involved. And then lastly, it will be very important to allow time and capacity for communities to deliberate before projects advance. One of the Cordova project team members had characterized Cordova's interest in mCDR as conditional and cautious. And we observed more openness to small-scale research-oriented projects than to big commercial projects. And also during the workshop, people repeatedly emphasized the importance of scale, that scale matters, and that tolerance for large or rapidly scaled projects would be very low. And then probably one of the biggest take-homes was that more familiarity and engagement is needed pretty much at all levels. So that's the stage in Alaska right now, and I will pass it off to my friend and colleague Med Chadsey at Washington Sea Grant to learn about Washington State.
Hi, thank you, Darcy. It's always hard to follow you because You just do a terrific job as a centerpiece of the Alaska mCDR scene. Um, I'm Meg Chadsey. I am the carbon specialist at Washington Sea Grant, based in the University of Washington Seattle campus, and I'm also liaison to the world-class carbon dioxide research group at NOAA Pacific Marine Environmental Labs, which is just up the road from the UW here in Seattle. I have been increasingly engaged with marine carbon dioxide removal as Washington and the broader Pacific Northwest have really emerged as, dare I say, a hotbed of research and development over the last 5 to 7 years. And as a marine extension program, Washington Sea Grant occupies the space between research institutions like the UW and NOAA and the broad coastal constituencies and communities who rely on science to make informed decisions. So accordingly, a lot of what I do in the mCDR space involves convening researchers and those constituents, which is my term for anyone with ties to or an interest in this growing sector, to exchange information and try to have constructive discussions about what CDR could and should look like in our region. So my first slide here, well, actually, I want to pause and see if my Devon in British Columbia is also co-presenting during this segment of the thing. But okay, never mind. I'll let Devon introduce himself when we pass the torch. So to get back to it, the ocean climate landscape in Washington, I would describe it as favorable, both culturally and politically. Our three-term governor, Jay Inslee, did manage to get his kind of signature legislation, the Climate Commitment Act, passed before he left office last year. And the Climate Commitment Act created or has created a market-based compliance program to require the state's largest carbon polluters to reduce their greenhouse gas pollution. And what this means is a limited and gradually over the years declining number of pollution credits are auctioned off via the cap and trade or cap and invest program. And the revenue is then reinvested in climate resiliency and mitigation programs in the state. And to date, 15 in 2 years in, I think 15 million offset credits have been auctioned, generating billions of dollars for this purpose in the state. It's really important to note that at least 35% of these funds generated by the auction must be invested in projects that benefit overburdened communities to help them deal with the transition to a carbon-free economy. And a minimum of 10% of the projects must go to projects with tribal support. Um, but I should say that there are no marine carbon credits being sold. The state is firmly grounded in the terrestrial space so far. And that in my conversations with people at the Department of Ecology, which manages this program, um, there's going to have to be a lot of learning before they can wade offshore into the water. And also the cost of credits will probably have to come below $100 a ton of carbon in order for the state to engage in a marine carbon credit market in this particular program. Another super important driver in our state are the Washington tribes. So just as they played a really important role in finally getting the Climate Commitment Act passed, it took several tries to get this through our legislature. They are also an extremely powerful force for climate policy and action in our state as formal co-managers of Washington's natural resources, which came about as a result of a landmark federal court ruling upholding their treaty rights over 50 years ago. And this is a pretty unique to Washington state. It's really elevated the stature and the power of tribes in our state, which is amazing for our climate and ocean policy because they are leaders in stewarding the health of our environment. And so finally, with a lot of our population in Washington living along our coastline, particularly the inland waters of Washington state in Puget Sound and Hood Canal, and the fact that we have always had a very maritime dependent economy, we just have a strong legacy of community engagement and concern for marine issues. Next slide, please. So how does this translate for mCDR in Washington State? While Washington doesn't yet have any formal mCDR policy or legislation, we do have state level bodies that are focused on the impacts of excess carbon on the marine environment. Those two are listed here at the top, my top bullet, the Marine Resources Advisory Council and the Olympic Coast Ocean Acidification Sentinel Site, nicknamed MRAC and OASES. So while both MRAC and OASES were created to focus on the problem of ocean acidification, which is, of course, a carbon problem, they're certainly aware of mCDR as a potential solution, as one of the potential solutions to our carbon problem, not the least of which because I participate on both these bodies and am told I never shut up about it. And MRAC has an mCDR committee now, and where they are at right now is they just want to learn, which is great. Darcy mentioned that learning. Alaska is a state where everybody could afford to understand mCDR better. Washington is not different, and I'm I'm really happy to be part of the engaging with policymakers through MRAC to make sure that people have that information. Okay, the second item, Partnerships for Tribal Carbon Solutions, is a national but locally led program of the Global Ocean Health nonprofit, and they're engaging tribes in assessing carbon removal opportunities and risks, supporting tribes to develop their own leadership in carbon removal development and governance, and assisting tribes in leveraging carbon removal to meet climate targets and advance their community objectives for environmental health and stewardship. And the picture on the right is of Fawn Sharp, former president of the Quinault Indian Nation in Washington State, and currently the president of the Indigenous Greenhouse Gas Removal Commission, which is a program of tribal carbon solutions. Assets and capacity. I'd like to say Washington State has got it going on. Our region, a lot of elements taken together make our region exceptionally well suited to host a field research hub that can advance various approaches for mCDR and get them from theory into at least trials, if not commercial practice. Some of these elements that are varied test environments. We have open ocean waters, we have inland waters, we've got estuaries, we have like California and other West Coast states, we have great oceanographic data sources. This is a well-studied region, and in order to see what happens when you perturb the carbon chemistry of the marine environment, you also have to know what it looked like before you did that perturbation, before you did an experiment. And so these long-term baseline data sets that we have and monitoring capacity are another thing that make Washington really a great place to do this. We've got top-notch expertise at our academic institutions and the NOAA research facilities. We've got built infrastructure, we have marine labs, we have progressive regulatory attitudes, and we have those engaged communities. So what has this led to? Well, lots of research and development. An example, a more recent example is, and a great example is Project Macoma, which is in Port Angeles, Washington, closer, still within the inland Salish Sea, but closer to the Pacific coast. And this is a private endeavor by Ebb Carbon, one of the leading mCDR startups. And they were able to secure the first of a kind permit for an ocean alkalinity commercial scale facility in Port Angeles, which is now operating. And the state's regulators, the regional regulators, really showed an openness to engaging with them to ensure that this research and development project is responsible. And let's see, Ebb worked very closely in close consultation with tribal interests and leaders as well as state regulators. And this project really is a does demonstrate that the region's authorities are willing to work with innovators and researchers to ensure both environmental protection while enabling pilot projects for R&D as well as responsible commercial ventures. Next slide, last slide too. All right. So Devin's going to speak to this, so I'm not going to steal his thunder, but I will just point out that Washington's inland waters, which is kind of everything from the Straits of Juan de Fuca on in into Puget Sound, are part of the broader Salish Sea, but it's just the bottom half. The rest extends up into Canada and British Columbia. So we share these waters with BC and the Indigenous First Nations. And obviously, there's no way to contain any mCDR activities that take place in Washington waters, to prevent them from flowing up northward. So it really behooves us to come together as a transboundary mCDR community. And I'll just tease that we are moving in the right direction. All right, so the Pacific Northwest mCDR node is a community of practice that I co-lead with colleagues in British Columbia. And it was launched approximately 2 years ago as part of a national network of kind of a grassroots network of nodes. California also has one. The Pacific Northwest node encompasses a vast territory of Oregon, Washington, British Columbia, and Alaska. Obviously, we can't get together in person too often, so we do try to stay connected virtually, but we have pulled off a couple of in-person events. We had a launch pictured in the slide in the spring of 2024, and more recently this September, we hosted a West Coast Satellite mCDR Law and Policy Symposium. The main event was held in New York City, but we brought people together in person to participate in that as a hybrid site. And we maintain communications. And if you're interested in this, I'm going to put my email, make my email address available. Just write to me and I will add you to the listserv. All right. I'm almost done. In keeping with Washington Sea Grant's mission as a marine extension organization, I coordinate and support a lot of community engagement work in this area. And I'll just highlight one thing that's upcoming. Over the next 6 months, I and my colleague Jessica Cross with Pacific Northwest National Labs will host a series of workshops, community workshops for mCDR practitioners and coastal constituents to collectively consider what responsible mCDR research and development should look like in our region. This is funded by ClimateWorks Foundation. And I'll just end. There's a lot of research going on in our area. There has been this Salish Sea Integrated Research Initiative is just one of the most recent projects to launch. This is led by Alex Gagna at the University of Washington, and it will enhance regional mCDR modeling capacity and build out experimental capacity at UW Friday Harbor Labs in San Juan Islands, among other things. So that's just a teaser, and over to you, Devin.
All right, so I guess we'll go to the next slide. Hi, everybody. My name is Devin Todd. I'm a project manager at Ocean Networks Canada, as well as with the Solid Carbon Project, which I'll talk a bit more about in a moment. I'll start from the bottom with the highlights. So, Washington and British Columbia have share a very similar character in terms of the coastal areas and then how the waters look like. And so part of that motivated a new community of exploration. So we received, it was announced just the other day from MEOPAR. We were awarded funding to establish a BC and Washington mCDR community of exploration, and the goal of this is to explore responsible, inclusive, and evidence-based mCDR in the Salish Sea area. And so it's really new, and I would invite people to click on the link and join, and we are really excited to get that going. So turning to kind of the environment that we find ourselves here in British Columbia and Canada from a regulatory and a political environment. I would say that the climate is arguably ambivalent towards marine carbon dioxide removal and carbon dioxide removal generally. We still have both federally and provincially climate plans. There are pledges to achieve net zero. Within those plans, however, CDR and mCDR are not really addressed in a full way. Right now, because of recent geopolitical developments over the past year or so, the narrative and the discourse in Canada has shifted drastically towards economic priorities, and in particular, trying to secure more diversity in our economic partners. That's how that has developed. So we'll see to what extent CDR might feature as a means to reconcile economic priorities and climate priorities, but we're not there yet. All right. Now, meanwhile, though, and from the ground up, and this might be better perhaps for the longer term, is that we are seeing a growing interest in marine carbon dioxide removal across academia, so researchers as well as in community members and industry, and so that's exciting. And the COEX is as I mentioned, the community of exploration is an example of that. So next slide, please. And so I mentioned some British Columbia highlights. So I mentioned I'm representing here Ocean Networks Canada, and what Ocean Networks Canada does is we operate ocean observatories, networked ocean observatories. So they're all real-time data on all of Canada's coasts. And here you can see an illustration of our networks on the west coast here. And what we would like to do is be a field partner for co-created marine carbon dioxide removal. And so some examples of what we've been doing in that space there, the metal frame structure that you see in the other picture sitting on a pier, this is called the benthic lander, and that was used to develop, to undertake the first of kind experiments looking at the fate of biomass sunk to great depths. So that paper or the results from that have been accepted and are not quite live yet, but the highlight there is that it was observed that there's very rapid turnover of seaweed by deep sea organisms. So the little critters ate it. Another example of work that we're supporting and that I'm part of is solid carbon. So solid carbon aims to couple marine carbon dioxide removal with CO2 geosequestration in basalt rock beneath the seafloor in the Cascadia Basin, which is off the coast of Vancouver Island. So the basalt here would react with CO2 and form solid carbonates to provide a robust means of CO2 storage. So on this project, we were awarded last year $24 million from the federal government to explore that in the field. And as well, as part of that, it's not just a geoscience exercise or engineering exercise, but solid carbon is also an example of the sort of transdisciplinary work that Ocean Networks Canada and the project Solid Carbon would like to see more of in the marine carbon dioxide removal space. As this project also involves researchers in social science, history, policy, economics, and more. So next slide, and I'll just have some highlights of that. So here's some project highlights, and these are insights that are from partners, social scientists, Sarah Nawaz, Terry Satterfield, Julie Bellotti from American University and University of British Columbia, that were conducted as part of Solid Carbon, as well as other initiatives relating to mCDR it's actually cross-border in some of these examples. So the first is a highlight here, and the links can be put in the chat. It was observed scenarios are an effective tool to elicit discussions of trade-offs and values with communities. So these are community workshop-based results that I'm quoting here. And then part of scenarios, and I think this was mentioned earlier in the webinar today, talking about scale really surfaces new kinds of conversations. And in particular, what we observed, this isn't accepted yet, but it's in the publication process, and I can speak to it, is we observed a stronger critique of naturalness and what constitutes naturalness when we talk about scale, like projects at scale. And talking about projects at scale also bring up more questions about governance. Who's owning it? Where the credits, if credits are a product, where are they destined, and how would they be used under what terms? How do mCDR projects even eventually wind down? What's the end goal? These are the kind of questions that come up in these conversations. I'd also like to highlight a great piece about It's in the context of ocean alkalinity enhancement, but it has lessons for marine carbon dioxide removal in general. Is the paper here, or sorry, a best practice guide. It's called Engaging Coastal Communities on Ocean Alkalinity Enhancement. And so that gives a set of recommendations on what proponents of of OE in this case, but mCDR generally, should be considering and doing as part of community engagement for projects. Lastly, I just mentioned there is an upcoming BC Ocean Acidification and Hypoxia Action Forum, and that's happening in Nanaimo, British Columbia in March 3rd. So I'd invite you to take a look at that if that is interesting. And so that's the end of my slides. And so with that, I would like to introduce Francis Chan from Oregon State University.
Thank you so much, Devin. Hello, everyone. Francis Chan from Oregon State University. I'm a marine ecologist, and I look at marine ecosystems usually through the lens of biogeochemistry. Next slide, please. Yeah, so I want to launch by sharing the Oregon ocean climate landscape, and I'm going to use an example from something that I'm quite familiar with, which is the ocean acidification hypoxia process, OAH. We started in 2016 with a set of panel recommendations that led to a bill in the Oregon Senate that actually established a body that coordinates action on ocean acidification and hypoxia. That then led to a bill that recommended funding for new science to support actions, decision making, and through the Oregon Ocean Science Trust, a number of projects have been started, funded, and they range from efforts looking at how do we monitor changes in the ocean in terms of OA and hypoxia, how do we model mitigation potential, and also how do we communicate the science of ocean acidification and hypoxia. Next slide. The mCDR landscape, policy-wise, it's very light. We're just starting to dive into it. But 2 months ago, the governor issued an executive order focusing on reducing, accelerating reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, but also enhancing carbon management. And discussions are that blue carbon and by extension mCDR, and that's a very uncomfortable association for many of us scientists, but the thought is thinking about how do we manage the ocean so that they're better at managing carbon. And of course, one of our representatives, Congressman Bonamici, she's the co-chair of the House Ocean Caucus, and she's advanced legislation specifically to try to establish a federal mCDR program to help manage and guide and also fund mCDR science. Next slide. And but the conversation about mCDR, it really is about ocean uses, and I think it's important to think about it in terms of what has been tried, what has been successful, and what has not been successful. If you look at cables, undersea cables along the West Coast, you'll notice that Oregon is the terminus for a lot of cross-Pacific cables. And it's not that we just love cables in Oregon, but that there's been a process that allows industry to work with coastal fishing communities to gain authorization to place cables. It's asking the industry a lot. It's asking them to not give up certain areas that they're used to fishing in. We also have an example of science where the community has agreed to set aside a parcel of the ocean, quite a large part, for the purpose of advancing science around wave energy. The Packwave facility is actually up and running. And I think this reflects Darcy's comment that communities can have appetite for doing things that are about getting more information scientifically, but the appetite for implementing something for industry is a little low, quite a bit lower. We've had some kind of oddballs. A wine company is trying to use our ocean to age wine, but of course, offshore wind has been an exceptionally contentious issue for us in Oregon. This article is dated October of 2024, so this is before the administration. So before the end of the Biden administration, offshore wind was already really a dead topic because of really ineffective engagement that the industry lost the community and the community rose up. Next slide. Now, I, while I have students, I have staff in my research institute, and I also have colleagues at OSU that work on mCDR. I've asked for prior permission to really use this time to share. We've been here before, so let's see if we, in terms of ocean acidification hypoxia science, and is there something we can learn from it? If we go back a decade plus, uh, the science around, it's very familiar to what we're facing right now, right? Science was far from settled in terms of ocean acidification and hypoxia. And there's a risk that actions can get ahead of policy, and there's a risk that policy can get ahead of science. And there's also a risk that science might not actually be relevant, because if we weren't able to show up and demonstrate that we have input, then why would they engage with us? And another issue is that the window for policy setting is narrow. We like to think that we have the benefit of a lot of time to come up with an answer before policy is set. Well, attention span is short, and people will move on to other things. They might very well not move forward. Next slide. And then I think there's something about the way that we do science that's worth thinking about, is that, we also saw that we needed to grow scientific understanding very quickly and efficiently, but we lacked a strategic approach with priorities and timelines that were clear. And I would also argue that a lot of our science was fairly siloed and narrowly scoped, meaning, we had, the physical chemists, just starting to talk to the biological oceanographers, but we were really far from engaging social scientists and others in the field in the conversation. And we really didn't understand the policy landscape or what our roles should be as scientists, as subject matter experts. And there were also there were clear conflict of interest concerns that were starting to bubble up. So in a sense, we can just replace mCDR, for OAH, and we're in the same spot. Next slide, please. We did take an approach, the community did take an approach where the state of Oregon, Washington, California, and the province of BC really joined together, and these are the governors in the premier's office, joined together to convene a science panel. This was led by the California Ocean Science Trust, and they're here again today. And we put together a group of scientists. There's 20 of us, and you'll see some familiar faces, and you also see people that are also actively working mCDR. My colleague Burke Hales, George Walbuster at OSU. This is science that they're working on right now. But back when we're trying to understand the issue of OAH, this was an experiment. Can we take science and move that into policy and into action? And even surprising to me, I co-chaired this, and we were quite successful. We, as direct outcome of the science synthesis and recommendations, we were able to motivate the passage of at least 2 pieces of legislation in Oregon and 2 pieces of legislation in California. That also led to action plans. Next slide, please. And then I think importantly, I want to recognize that we had champions that were really important. We had partners outside of science that were fundamentally important, and that over the time we went from skepticism to engagement and involvement. On the left, Mark Weigart, he was the proprietor of Whiskey Creek Shellfish Hatchery. He was the first business that were at risk of going bankrupt because of ocean acidification. My colleague Burke Hales and also George Walbuster worked with that industry and developed solutions, developed ways for them to monitor and manage their water chemistry. And fast forward today, unfortunately, Mark Weigart passed away a little over a year ago. But we have established a memorial fellowship in honor of Mark's legacy, and this is Riley Smith up at PMEL, the Preeminent Carbon Chemistry Program, where this undergraduate engineering student is developing a sensor, an optical pH sensor to serve the shellfish growth industry. On the right, we have an example where instead of skepticism about hypoxia, we now work with commercial fishermen to deploy oxygen sensors in commercial fishing gear so they play a role in tracking and detecting hypoxic zones. Next slide, please. So some lessons learned from this process. One is that I think we gain an understanding that, and to understand and develop the authorizing environment. What I mean is that it was really important that there was already an appetite for science from policymakers, and actually we learned to help develop and bring those policymakers along so that when we were done, they were ready to act. Uh, I think we acknowledge that science is unsettled, and that's fine to say. We don't know, but we didn't leave it there. Okay, we were also I think we saw that it was important to be strategic and prioritize. It wasn't going to be useful. We told policymakers that, oh, we need $100 million every year for the next 50 years to come up with an understanding before actions can be taken. That would have been a non-starter, and they would have moved on to different topics, different problems. And we also try to prioritize within a framework that was objective. So we want to look at, if we were to do the science, what's the return on investment? When do we get results that are actionable? And what are the decision opportunities that are going to be matched with new science? And I think we started to understand our role of subject matter experts. I was very reticent about engaging with state legislators. I remember being asked to help write a law, and I said, no, that's insane. But over time, I realized that, if we're not providing the input into legislation, then somebody else will, and they will have, are not likely to have the kind of understanding we have. We also learned that it was really important to curate and communicate recommendations. We didn't write at home. Our report was 35 pages long with the appendix, and it was designed in a way that each page could really had a recommendation for policymakers to act. Next slide, please. But I think things are, of course, different with mCDR. I mean, these are two quotes of people in government relations or staffers that I've spoken have communicated. One is, hey, isn't this just cloud doping but in the ocean? And hey, we're not going to take the industry's word for it that it works, are we? So this is really about ocean use, and we have to really recognize that. Instead of solving problems, we're really bringing a risky thing to local communities. We have a research funding landscape where private sector really leads, and that can be quite uncomfortable for the optics are not going to be great. Might not be great. And I think the conflicts of interest potential are much higher because a lot of people working in the field are being funded by industry that would benefit from a certain answer. We just have to be very cognizant of that and take that on front and center. The social licensing needs are much higher, and the willingness to try something much lower. With OAH, there were a lot of people in industry communities that wanted to try something. I'm not seeing that kind of appetite. I will say that I think the trust opportunities can be quite high because, if I put out my hat as an academic, we can be trusted brokers of information, but only if we don't blow it. And I think it's clear that we need to really articulate, what is science advocating for? Are we advocating for better information, or are we advocating for a specific outcome that benefits a specific industry? With that, I will stop and hand it off to my colleague in California, Kevin.
Great. All right. Thank you, Francis. And great to be with everyone. I will be the last leg of this, regional journey on marine carbon dioxide removal, and I'm here to speak about California's perspective on this topic. My name is Kevin Travis. I'm a senior science officer with California Ocean Science Trust. For a quick reminder, we're a state-established organization with a mission to bridge the gap between scientific research and sound ocean management here in California. We do this by bringing clear, credible science decision making, building multi-institutional science collaborations, and mobilizing resources to advance science priorities in the state. So today we execute this mandate by serving as a science advisor to the state on ocean and coastal issues. We also engage heavily with the scientific community on their emerging research, and we're developing towards becoming a financial trust to steward funding to support different strategic priorities in the region. So in my role as a senior science officer, I help lead our work on marine carbon dioxide removal. And in this role, I engage both in the science and policy settings on this topic. And in the past few years, we've really worked to bring together scientists, experts, and policymakers to explore what responsible mCDR research and development could look like in California. So next slide. Diving into it, California's ocean climate landscape, I want to start from a scientific standpoint here. The California current system, as many know, is a heavily studied marine system, providing a lot of long-term oceanographic data sets, regional models, and intensive research into the biology, climate, physical, and social conditions of this marine system. This also includes a couple significant ocean observing systems, and I want to highlight a few, or just a couple here on the slide, including the 50 plus years of Cal Coffee ship-based ocean observations that's indicated on the slide that spans all the way from Southern California to Central. I also want to mention in Northern California, there's a surveys such as the Trinidad Head Ocean Observing Node, which additionally provides long-term data up on the northern coast. And California is really a hub of innovative climate solutions that have stemmed from our state's academic and science institutions up and down the coastline. And that branching out of academic research into different small-scale pilot tests of mCDR in our state waters in recent years. A lot of these startups and small-scale pilot projects are leveraging different public-private models, of which I'll briefly touch on one of those in a moment here in my presentation. And I pulled this from Ocean Vision's field trial database map, and you can see a cluster of these down in Southern California. Next slide. All right, so from a policy perspective, there really exists a suite of agencies in California that handle both ocean and climate topics. So California really takes a coordinated governance approach to ocean climate policy, and this is even more relevant, I'd say, for an issue like marine carbon dioxide removal. And to highlight just a few of those on the slide, California Air Resources Board is our lead agency for regulating greenhouse gas emissions, meeting climate goals, and also it's responsible for our state's cap and trade, but now termed cap and invest program. We also have Ocean Protection Council, which is our lead agency for really safeguarding our ocean and coastal ecosystems. There's also the State Water Resources Control Board that sets water quality standards and permitting, and then many more. So California Coastal Commission and others that all coordinate, like I said, and collaborate on various ocean climate issues. But looking a little bit closer on carbon management, we really see in the past 5 years an accelerating policies and initiatives on carbon management in California. This is including topics like setting greenhouse gas targets, inventories, leveraging different market-based mechanisms, investing in infrastructure and state capacity building to have the technical expertise on this topic, as well as research and development funding and developing more regulation to enable that research and development in the state. Next slide. So in recent months, the governor has really released a comprehensive carbon management strategy. And among many various components of this strategy, there's the core tenet that integrating CDR will be a vital supplement to, but not a substitute for, direct emissions reductions to reach our net zero goal by 2045. And so you can move forward on this slide. I wanted to just highlight a couple of these policy mechanisms that are directly relevant for CDR. So starting with target setting, as I mentioned, California has a net zero goal to reach by 2045, and this will require, and as indicated, it will require around 15% of that to come from CDR to account for those hard to abate or residual emissions. So what is our roadmap, our pathway to getting to that 2045 goal? This is outlined in our what we call the scoping plan, which was updated in 2022, and that sets an annual removal target of 75 million metric tons by 2045. And then on the regulatory side, this has definitely been expanding and developing in recent years. The SB 905 program, or the Carbon Capture, Removal, Utilization, and Storage Program, which is housed under the Air Resources Board, has been developing their regulatory approach and a capacity to help enable and regulate CO2 removal, among many other different tasks for the state. And next slide. I want to just briefly mention a couple recent legislative proposals from last year. AB 1086, the Marine Carbon Initiative, was a specific mCDR R&D bill, and then SB 643, the Carbon Dioxide Removal Purchase Program, which was a grant program to fund CDR projects in California. Both of these did not get signed into law, but wanted just to highlight those, and if you're interested to learn more, please do reach out. Next slide. Alrighty, so turning to some project highlights on marine carbon dioxide removal in California, I want to highlight just a couple of few institutions that are conducting or supporting mCDR research in the state. And a caveat here that this certainly doesn't include all efforts. There's various institutions, nonprofits, startups that are coordinating and engaging and have future plans to conduct additional research in the state. So starting with Alta-C, if you're not familiar, this is a public-private institute that serves as really a blue economy innovation hub in Southern California. It's situated right on the Port of Los Angeles, and they are home to what they call a cluster of marine carbon dioxide removal research and development projects. And this includes industry groups like Captura and Aquatic, as well as nonprofit research institutions like Hourglass Climate conducting laboratory work. And then there's also the Southern California Coastal Water Research Project, which is a partner of this webinar series. They've been collaborating with Captura at the Alta-C Port of Los Angeles using numerical modeling, such as the Regional Ocean Modeling System down in Southern California, to conduct scenario testing of what direct ocean capture could look like in the Southern California bight. Welcome to reach out to Christina Frieder at SQUIRP to learn more about those efforts. And then lastly, I also wanted to mention Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institution. This group has been collaborating with the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, providing scientific support to the 2025 Loch Ness field trial. This was the first EPA-approved ocean alkalinity research trial in federal waters on the East Coast. And this the Monterey Bay MBARI Institute, they helped provide scientific support through autonomous vehicle sampling of the plume. I highly encourage you to look into the Loch Ness project and the really wealth of knowledge and data that's coming out of that effort on the East Coast. All right, next slide. And then, as others have mentioned, there's been various engagement efforts within California. We also have, as Meg has indicated, a California Current regional node that's housed under the U.S. Ocean Carbon and Biogeochemistry Program. In 2024, that group helped or supported a workshop at SQUIRP that scoped the environmental risk of mCDR in California's coastal waters. Please do get in touch with those co-leads that are listed: Alex Harper, Kristen Davis, and Christina Frieder. And then in 2025, California Ocean Science Trust held a first of its kind California Forum on abiotic mCDR in Sacramento. This really was developed in coordination with state agency staff, and it gathered scientists, developers, experts to come together to understand the scientific advancements and specific research opportunities in California on abiotic approaches. And I would say there was also a really great thread and outcome about what are the workforce development needs that need to get started now for this field to really have sustainable growth. And we hope to have summary results from that forum out soon. All right, next slide. That really concludes the end of what's happening in California, but to broaden it back out before we open it up for a Q&A discussion with all the panelists, California Ocean Science Trust is also helping steward regional coordination on marine carbon dioxide removal, really anchored by this webinar partnership here. But to help understand what the regional opportunities may be going forward, we conducted a survey late 2025 that reached nearly 100 respondents to really understand what are those opportunities moving forward, where are current coordinating efforts happening along the region, and how can we better coordinate going forward on mCDR science along the North American Pacific coast. So real briefly, some of the results from those surveys. You can move forward on the slide. There was, strong interest in being a part of a regional coordinating group or entity or effort. Nearly 70% were very to extremely interested, and 77% saw that this is a necessary need for the field to move forward. You can move forward on the slide. And then who were the folks that really responded to this, that were showing interest? It was quite broad in who we reached with this survey, but there was quite a strong academic representation in the results. And then we had engagement not just in California or any specific area, but along the North American Pacific coast. And you can move forward on the slide. So looking ahead, we're really wanting to work with the partners behind this webinar series and others around this region to find ways to really cultivate regional coordination. And we want to focus on how can we as a group be sharing information, lessons learned, many of the lessons learned like Francis shared today about the OAH community, and also resources that transcend both physical and institutional boundaries on this topic. OST in particular is interested in activating academic capacity to address mCDR needs by building cross-sector collaborations, mobilizing funding opportunities, as well as science to policy exchanges on this topic. And I would say we're really taking a nested approach, nested, flexible approach to this regional mCDR coordination. And it's really co-led by existing and growing, I would say, partnerships all listed here on the slide. So I'll conclude there. Thank you all for the time, and I'll pass it back to my colleague Melanie to kick us off on the Q&A.
Thanks, Kevin, and thanks everyone for such a great overview of what's happening around the Pacific Coast in the mCDR world. Appreciate you, Darcy, Meg, Devin, and Francis for your support. Feel free to come back, turn your cameras back on as we begin our moderated Q&A section. So before we start with the first question, we're gonna start another poll on what the mCDR community needs most in this moment. So please select maybe your top 3 priorities that you think are needed to advance mCDR in the next 1 to 2 years. And I'll give you all some time to respond to that. And in the meantime, I'm gonna pose our first question. Appreciate everyone for adding a bunch of questions in the chat. And I'll start with our first one. Meg, I think maybe you could start with this one. Is there a risk of trying to get more carbon dioxide into the ocean, risking increased ocean acidification?
Thank you, Melanie. And thanks for asking that question because it comes up a lot. And I have been trying to think of a good way to frame the answer. And I'm excited to have some oceanographers like Francis around who can check my metaphor that I'm going to test for the first time here. So yes, as someone who spent almost a decade focused exclusively on ocean acidification before getting really focused on mCDR, I do understand that people hear a lot, putting carbon in the ocean is bad. It causes ocean acidification. Carbon dioxide meets seawater and carbonic acid and a cascading series of chemical changes as the result. So it's very confusing to hear people say, we think we should put carbon in the ocean. And so here is the way I've been thinking of framing it. When carbon dioxide dissolves naturally, spontaneously into the ocean, the spontaneous chemical reaction that occurs is the one that generates carbonic acid and leads to the broader effects of ocean acidification. But it is also possible with extra effort, thermodynamic effort, I should sort of say, to push that carbon in a different, safer direction and move it into a different form of inorganic carbon in the ocean, bicarbonate, that is basically harmless in terms of affecting the carbonate chemistry and in terms of it doesn't cause ocean acidification. But that's not the direction carbon naturally, spontaneously wants to go. So these mCDR approaches that are putting carbon in and trying to direct it into this safe form of bicarbonate, that requires extra energy, either chemical energy or electricity to sort of push against this like natural thermodynamic tendency and get it into the safe form. But it can be done. And once you convert that dissolved carbon dioxide into bicarbonate, it's happy to sit there. It joins the rest of the carbon in the ocean. Almost all the carbon in the ocean is already in the form of bicarbonate. So adding a little bit extra doesn't really tip the scales in any direction. So, but it does take work. So it's just not going to happen on its own. Francis, do you want to like say, boy, don't use that metaphor again?
No, I think I think if you're adding DIC, you just want to make sure you add it. You match addition of alkalinity. But the way I think about it is that we have processing fishing processing boats that would like to dump their waste into the continental shelf. So that's exporting organic carbon that's respired at depth. And we don't like that, or we think that's a risky thing because that vertical flux of organic carbon is, risk increasing acidification and decreasing amount of oxygen. So if we want to enhance artificial upwelling or fertilize the ocean and increase export production, we have to we have to demonstrate why is that different than someone dumping a shipload of fish guts into the ocean. So there's some science that we can do, but I think we can see the answer, right?
Thanks, Megan Francis. It looks like there's been quite a conversation in the chat as well about just the overall global carbon cycle. So following that thread, we talked a little bit about organic biomass, like seaweed being turned over, and someone posed a question if anyone is considering the microbial loop. So I don't know if Francis or any of our other speakers have any insight to the science being done with mCDR, if the microbial loop is being considered, or any other ecological process you think is important as this research continues.
I always share that this is where we're kind of limited because we're one sector of the ocean MCDR community. But if this was a broader, more international conversation, recognizing BC's here, the efforts out of the Global Once program, the focus is really around manipulation of the microbial carbon cycle. It's about manipulating, enhancing the production of recalcitrant DOC. So if we were having this conversation on the other side of the Pacific, we would probably be talking about microbes and carbon much more than kelp and iron fertilization.
Yeah, that's a great insight. It's definitely location dependent. I know we talked a little bit about that in the Q&A chat as well. And I have a question later on about coordination and thinking about it on an international level, how valuable that will be for the conversation of marine carbon dioxide removal. But for now, we can close down poll number 4. Appreciate everyone for including the responses. It looks like our most common priority is risk assessments, socioeconomic, environmental, and more. So appreciate everyone asking that. I know we have about 15 more minutes of the Q&A, so I'm just going to keep moving along. There's a question posed about ocean iron fertilization, knowing that it's a controversial pathway. We've heard that OIF research is happening offshore of Alaska, and this person is interested if there's support for OIF in Washington, Oregon, or California. They mentioned it seems to be one of the more promising areas of carbon sequestration and improving fisheries at the same time. Any comments on tests in other part of the world? And again, they had a specific interest in Washington, Oregon, and California. So I can start with, is anyone ready to go with this question?
I'll weigh in. This just feels like deja vu because I feel like this happened 10 years ago where a company went out and dumped a whole bunch of iron to try to sell the credit. So I spent my career looking at oxygen and carbon dioxide in this density layer of water, 26.5 density layer of water that's coming at us from the north. So I don't, it's problematic when that water has more and more CO2 in it and less oxygen. So you're enhancing the production of remineralization at depth, and that water is somebody else's source water and just happens to be Meg and mine's source water for our upwelling. So, tread cautiously.
All right, I'll go. Uh, a short way of answering this question is, am I aware of any research activities um, into this particular form of biotic? I consider it biotic mCDR um, in the research communities that I'm in touch with in Washington State. Not really, not, and that could be because I can't keep track of everything. I know that there is some work at the University of Washington, sort of related, looking at stimulating the growth of microalgae through the provision of nutrients, not necessarily iron, in an open ocean setting. That the research project I'm thinking of, carried out by Mari Winkler at the UW, is interesting in that microalgae, which are very, very tiny, just like the organisms that would be stimulated by the addition of iron to the ocean, it's hard to keep them in one place. And so Mari's research involves kind of a gel-like matrix in which the microalgae would grow inside of some sort of net out in the open ocean. So you can keep them in one place. And for me personally, I think I recognize this as a real challenge of ocean iron fertilization, which is you're basically spreading something that will stimulate the growth of photosynthetic organisms in the ocean. But after you put it out there, you can no longer really tell it where to go. That goes for the iron, which will probably be rapidly taken up, but it also goes for the things that take it up that are modal, are able to move through the ocean or are moved by currents. So um, it's a very challenging kind of experiment to do. Even more challenging to do as a scale as a uh, actual tool to address carbon dioxide. So no, and there's no like political support in Washington for this. Of course, there are people interested in it like there are everywhere.
Thanks, Meg and Francis. I think that's really helpful. I think this will probably resonate a lot with folks that there's mCDR is such a nascent field and that many pathways are, I think just assessments and research being done on all pathways is really important. And a lot of these questions are, I know, ones we've heard before. A question for Darcy to discuss some efforts with the fishing community. I know you mentioned that the fishing industry was sort of concerned about the impacts of mCDR. So, are you aware of any studies that have investigated the impacts of mCDR on fisheries, or can you provide any insight from your perspective on coordination and engagement with these two communities?
Yeah, and I should say too, it's like we're like so early in our engagement in Alaska, and it's been more with the first two efforts have been local community conversations instead of with, like big fishing industry members. So there's a lot more, I think, awareness and conversations and questions. I can speak to some of the questions that came up. In these first two community workshops, this conversation we had just now on ocean iron fertilization and like how much we know about what would happen to those blooms was definitely of a lot of interest in Kodiak. Thinking about this ocean iron fertilization project 600 miles offshore, which is pretty far offshore, but they were very keen on knowing like how that might impact the timing and location of the bloom and how that might impact the fish they catch. And I know for those of us that were um, organizing, putting on the workshop, we were thinking like, how do we need to go out and look for what research has been done for these types of things. And I am not an authority on that right now, but will be, I guess, in part of this collective group of people that's trying to identify what information is out there and how we bring it to those that are going to need it to help provide informed local input to projects that are coming towards them. So I don't have a lot of good science answers right now, other than we will be part of the effort to try to understand like what's out there and how to transfer it. Um,
Thanks, Darcy. And I think that's super valuable to know of your effort doing that and leading sort of the collaborations there. I wanted to pick up more on the collaborating topic. I know many of you are already collaborating across regions in many different ways. Maybe we can go around the room for everyone. From your perspective, what do you think is working well in those collaborations and what could be improved? I know Darcy just mentioned the collaboration with fishers and likely other ocean users. I would love to hear what could be improved to make coordination more effective or more inclusive, or both. Kevin, would you want to start? I have you at the top of my screen.
Sure. Thanks, Melanie. Yeah, as I mentioned, we've been collaborating with many sectors in California, and doing so more outside of California going forward. But what's been working well, is I think a lot of the work that California Ocean Science Trust has done is addressing not just the level of awareness and understanding of what marine carbon dioxide removal means, but also questions and concerns around trust in the science. And something that's helped that is early and often engagement with the state's decision makers and regulators and managers, inside those conversations or inside those rooms that we're having with scientists and experts, and really tackling a lot of those concerns and questions around trust and science and data, head on, and letting both managers, industry representatives, academic scientists weigh in on that, and really building a trusted space for having those kind of difficult conversations. And then also what's been helpful too in these collaborative settings with different sectors is focusing in on what's really feasible for our region in California, both from specific pathways that are most feasible in our oceanographic settings, to also what kind of science infrastructure and opportunities, incentives exist in our region to help support responsible research. So I'd say those are just two pieces that have been helpful, is bringing in policymakers to the conversation early, and also really contextualizing the conversation with what's feasible and applicable in our region. But yeah, well, curious others' thoughts on this as well.
Thanks, Kevin. Absolutely. I think people probably resonate with engaging early on and really intentionally. So I really appreciate that. Francis, I'll pass it over to you if you have any thoughts on ways to improve coordination or inclusivity.
Well, I want to say that I think the effort that Meg's leading, the regional scale coordination, that's great because when things are small and underfunded, it's hard for someone has to carry the ball forward, and Meg's been really good at keeping Oregon engaged. We don't have as many private sector players right now. What's needed in the future, and I have to say that it's uncomfortable for me to say this, but I worry that this is not a science problem because what I learned is that when we had offshore wind come, I thought it was a science problem. I thought, well, how the hell are they going to anchor something floating in 6,000 meters of water? So I thought it was a technical engineering challenge. Turns out it was completely a social political challenge. The reason that it is dead in Oregon for now in federal waters is not because of technology. It's because of the way I think the social resistance to it. So it's hard because I'm a scientist. I don't, I want to know that natural science is the problem, but it might be that we need others to be much more prominent, if not lead this effort.
Yeah, absolutely. I saw in one of the chats that the metaphor of cart before the horse, and I think there's so many different complex sectors, perspectives, industry, science to weave in here, and it's hard to figure out what comes before the other, or the chicken and the egg situation. Devin, Meg, or Darcy, anything to add that hasn't already been said about ways to improve coordination and inclusivity in the mCDR world? Devin?
Yeah, I would just add that in the context of projects where we have money to do something, I think building in a broader representation of different disciplines within those projects is very helpful for broadening inclusivity and engaging with more audiences. So you have policy researchers who can position your project to effectively communicate with policymakers. We have and I'm talking about my experience here with solid carbon. We have social scientists who have been instrumental in being able to communicate with general publics. And I guess I would highlight that in those experiences our public experience has been in DC and Washington sampling at least, is that there isn't a rejection necessarily of mCDR. So it's good. And what's interesting also is that it's benefit centric. So people respond to the benefits when they hear more about them, and increases the interest or the at least the the acceptance of the technology. So that's a very different signature than other kind of novel technologies where often people are very risk averse, and we're not in that space. So this is promising for the sector.
I can just make a note of the importance of including the fishing community in conversations and co-design of projects, and um, as thought partners as well as implementation partners. And I want to highlight the work of Sarah Schumann. She's with the Fishery Friendly Climate Action Campaign and has started really focusing on trying to help fishermen across the country gain awareness of this topic, and again, like build capacity for informed input. She was a fisherman observer that went aboard the vessel for the Loch Ness field experiment. That was a ocean alkalinity enhancement test project in the Gulf of Maine this past year, and wrote up some blogs about that, and has become a trusted voice in the fishing industry space. And I think is also looking for ways right now to help continue to looking for funding and avenues to make sure that key voices of the fishing industry around the country are kept aware and involved, and really, yeah, not just on the side giving input, but really active participants in developing um, processes for both public engagement and potential implementation of projects, or involvement in MRV, or involvement in identifying when a project shouldn't move forward. So I'm going to put in the link to the chat in just a minute, some of the resources from the Fisheries Friendly Climate Action Campaign and Sarah Schumann.
Thanks so much, Darcy. Appreciate hearing that perspective. We are coming close on time, so I want to launch our last poll to get your guys' thoughts on what mCDR topics you'd be interested in seeing in a future webinar. So feel free to take a minute to answer that. Meg, I don't know if you had a thought on the last question, if you want to close that loop, and totally okay if not.
Yeah, and my fellow panelists have, I think, done a great job answering it. So what I want to give is a kind of an observation, maybe even an opinion. What Darcy was just saying about involving the fisheries. I want to draw analogies to where sort of the ocean acidification community was in the early 2000s, when the shellfish industry was just beginning to feel the impacts of ocean chemistry change on their ability to even raise shellfish. Baby oysters were dying in the hatcheries. This is the classic story. But they were the only ones who were noticing. No one else was really looking, but they were feeling the impacts, so they elevated the issue. And having industry, having people who are making their living from the ocean becoming loud voices for action, and so thinking of solutions. That's what led to it. Really catalyzed the uh, actions up and down the West Coast that, such as Washington State's Blue Ribbon Panel on Ocean Acidification, which was a direct line from industry to policymakers to really get a grip on a problem and think about what can be done. And that action in Washington State catalyzed things up and down the West Coast and then internationally. And it really, really helped create the ocean acidification community that we have today. And we need that same thing for mCDR. And I don't think you get the state level attention until you have people who live in those states saying, this is a problem, we need to do something about it. Although in this case, it would be we know we have a problem. Here's something that we might be able to do about it, and we want to see attention and funding and all the other things put into it. So in my perfect world, everything we're doing today in a couple of years would lead to somebody, either BC or a consortium of states, standing up something similar to the Blue Ribbon Panel on ocean acidification that Washington did, although focused on mCDR.
Thanks, Meg. I wish we could dive deeper into that question and more questions, but I think probably where we'll leave it off at is, it takes a village, and I appreciate you mentioning and reemphasizing that, Meg. Well, I know we are over time, and so I wanted to give a big thank you on behalf of OST and our partners for joining this webinar series. Thank you to our speakers for such a great conversation and our audience for joining. It's really been a great discussion. A recording of this webinar will be emailed out and made available online. You can find the recording and past webinars on YouTube, and we'll add a link to the chat. If you have any other questions that weren't answered, feel free to email our speakers directly. And if you're interested in regional conversations like this or opportunities to collaborate, please reach out to us and stay tuned for more webinars. So thank you again, and big round of applause to our speakers. Everyone have a great day. Thank you.